A broken girl standing at the edge of total emotional collapse, abandoned by everyone she ever trusted, is seconds away from disappearing into darkness when a stranger steps forward and holds her trembling hand, unaware that this single moment will ignite a destiny neither of them can escape. The rain did not fall gently that night. It crashed against the empty road like the sky itself had decided to mourn her existence. And beneath a flickering streetlight near the old bridge that divided two worlds, poverty and privilege, she stood completely still, her soaked clothes clinging to a body that had long stopped feeling warmth, her hollow eyes reflecting nothing but rejection, abandonment, and a shattered identity that even she no longer recognized. She was not always like this, not always invisible, not always reduced to silent pain and forgotten existence. But life had a cruel way of stripping away dignity piece by piece until all that remained was a fragile soul standing on the edge of giving up. Her name once carried dreams, whispered ambitions, and a pure heart filled with honesty, integrity, and hope. Yet the same world that once smiled at her innocence had turned its back with ruthless indifference, leaving behind scars carved by betrayal, humiliation, and emotional destruction so deep that even time refused to heal them. She had trusted, she had loved, she had believed in kindness and faith, but every promise made to her had dissolved into lies. Every hand that once held hers had let go when she needed it the most, and every door she knocked on had closed with a force strong enough to crush her spirit. Tonight was different, because tonight she had reached the end of her endurance, and, as she slowly stepped closer to the edge of the bridge, staring into the dark water below that mirrored her emptiness, she whispered to herself that perhaps disappearing was easier than fighting a world that had already decided she did not belong. There was no family waiting, no parents' blessing to guide her, no love left to hold on to, and certainly no miracle waiting to save someone like her, because people like her were not meant for restoration, they were meant to be forgotten. But destiny has a way of rewriting stories at the very moment they seem to end. And just as her foot moved forward with quiet finality, a hand reached out and gripped her wrist. Not forcefully, not violently, but with a firmness that carried something she had not felt in a long time. Certainty, warmth, and an unspoken promise that she was not alone. She froze instantly, her breath catching in her throat as she turned slowly, her tear-filled eyes meeting the calm, unreadable gaze of a man who stood completely untouched by the chaos around them, as though the storm itself respected his presence. There was something different about him, something that did not belong to the harsh reality she knew, because while the world had shown her cruelty, his silence spoke of kindness, humility, and a depth of character rooted in integrity and strength. He did not look at her with pity, nor did he see her as a burden. Instead, his gaze held a quiet understanding, as if he could see beyond her broken exterior into the fragments of a soul still worth saving. He was not just any man, although nothing about him revealed the truth immediately. His simple appearance concealed the reality that he was a wealthy man, a billionaire whose life existed in a completely different world, a world of power, respect, and social status that she could never imagine reaching. Yet in that moment, none of that mattered, because he did not approach her as a billionaire, but as a human being, as a destiny helper who had arrived at the exact second her life was about to disappear into darkness. "Let go," she whispered weakly, her voice trembling with exhaustion and quiet desperation. Yet even as she spoke, there was no strength behind her words, only the weight of someone who had fought too long and lost too much. His grip did not tighten in control, but in reassurance, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm yet powerful, carrying a depth that made her heart pause in confusion. "Is this how your story ends?" he asked softly. "Or is this where it begins?" The question struck her like something unfamiliar, something dangerous, because hope had always been more painful than despair, and she had learned the hard way that believing in life-changing love, faith, or kindness only led to deeper wounds. She pulled her hand slightly, her broken spirit resisting the possibility of another emotional test, another moment where she might believe only to fall again. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of everything she had endured. "People like me don't get miracles. We don't get happy endings. We don't get chosen. We get left behind. For a brief moment, silence surrounded them, the storm continuing its relentless rhythm. But he did not step away, and he did not release her hand, because something about her words carried a truth he refused to accept. He had seen wealth, power, and success. Yet he had also seen emptiness in places where money could not reach. And standing before him was not just a broken girl, but a story waiting to be rewritten. "You're wrong," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Kindness is never wasted, a pure heart is never invisible, and sometimes destiny chooses the most broken people to create the most powerful stories." She stared at him, confused, uncertain, and deeply afraid of believing him, because belief meant risking everything again, and she had nothing left to lose except the little strength holding her together. Yet there was something about his presence, something steady and unshaken, that made her hesitate for the first time that night, and that hesitation alone was enough to change everything. In that single unexpected meeting, beneath a storm that symbolized the chaos of her life, the first thread of an emotional transformation had already begun weaving itself into existence, although neither of them fully understood it yet. This was not just a moment of rescue. It was the beginning of a journey that would challenge her pain, test her faith, and lead her through a path of love, restoration, and a shocking reversal of fate that would one day turn her into someone the world could no longer ignore. Somewhere in the unseen future, there would be gratitude instead of despair, respect instead of rejection, and a life shaped by honesty, integrity, and a love so powerful it would redefine everything she believed about herself. There would be a marriage proposal no one expected, parents' blessing that once seemed impossible, and a story that would stand as proof that even the most broken beginnings could lead to extraordinary endings. But in this moment, she was still standing on the edge, still torn between giving up and holding on, still unsure whether the hand holding hers was a blessing or another illusion waiting to disappear. Just as she whispers that she has nothing left to live for, his grip tightens slightly, and with a quiet intensity that sends a shock through a fragile heart, he says, "If the world gave up on you, then let me be the reason it regrets it." And for the first time, she hesitates, not between life and death, but between fear and destiny. Before she became invisible to the world, she was once full of dreams, but one brutal betrayal after another crushed her identity until even her own reflection refused to recognize her. Long before that stormy night on the bridge where her life nearly ended, she had been a girl shaped by a humble beginning, raised in a quiet corner of society where dreams were not encouraged but endured in silence, and where survival often replaced hope before it even had the chance to grow. She was born into a family that believed more in endurance than affection, where kindness was rare, and where emotional warmth was considered a luxury rather than a necessity. Yet despite the absence of love, she carried within her a pure heart filled with faith, honesty, and an unexplainable belief that one day her life would rise beyond the limitations of her circumstances. She had always been different, not because she had more, but because she believed more, and while others accepted their struggles as permanent, she held on to the fragile idea that hard work, integrity, and humility could rewrite her destiny. In school, she stood out not for wealth or social status, but for her quiet strength and determination, often helping others even when she had nothing for herself, unknowingly living out the very principle that kindness, even in suffering, never goes unnoticed. But the world she lived in was not designed to reward pure hearts easily, and slowly, life began to test her in ways she was never prepared for. Her first encounter with betrayal came not from strangers, but from those she trusted the most, because when her family faced financial hardship, instead of standing together, they turned against each other, and she became the easiest target for blame, as though her existence itself was a burden too heavy for them to carry. Words were thrown at her like weapons, accusations that questioned her worth, her dreams, and even her right to hope for something greater. And with each insult, a piece of her confidence shattered quietly, leaving behind cracks that would only deepen with time. Still, she refused to give up, because somewhere deep within her, she believed that life-changing love, divine favor, and a miracle could still find her, even in the darkest moments. And it was this belief that pushed her forward in the next phase of her life, where she thought she had finally found someone who understood her, someone who saw beyond her struggles and into the strength she carried within. He had entered her life like an answered prayer, speaking words of affection, promising a future filled with hope, and making her believe that perhaps true love was not just a distant dream, but a reality she could finally hold on to. For the first time, she allowed herself to trust completely, to open her heart without fear, and to imagine a life where she would no longer feel invisible. She gave him everything she had, her loyalty, her honesty, her belief, never realizing that she was stepping into one of the most painful betrayals of her life. Because love, when placed in the wrong hands, becomes the most dangerous weapon. The same man who once spoke of forever began to change, slowly at first, then completely, and what started as affection turned into emotional manipulation, where her kindness was taken for granted, her sacrifices ignored, and her identity gradually erased under the weight of his control. He mocked her humble background, compared her to women of higher social status, and made her feel as though she would never be enough, no matter how much she tried. The emotional abuse became a daily reality, stripping away her dignity piece by piece until she no longer recognized the girl she once was. And then came the ultimate betrayal. One evening, in a moment that would forever define her fall, she discovered that the man she trusted had chosen someone else, not for love, but for wealth, status, and opportunity, proving to her that in a world driven by power, a pure heart often stands no chance against ambition. The humiliation was not private, it was public, exposed in a way that left her vulnerable to judgment, whispers, and cruel laughter, as people who once admired her resilience now saw her as a symbol of failure. Her emotional love story did not end in happiness, but in destruction. The pain did not stop there, because as she tried to rebuild herself, society delivered its own harsh verdict, reminding her that without connections, wealth, or influence, even talent becomes invisible. She applied for jobs tirelessly, walking into offices where her qualifications were overlooked, her confidence questioned, and her presence dismissed simply because she did not fit the image they desired. Doors closed one after another, each rejection carrying a silent message that she did not belong in a world reserved for those with privilege. In one particularly devastating moment, she stood before a panel of interviewers who barely looked at her, their disinterest clear, their judgment immediate, and when she was dismissed without even being given a chance to speak fully, she felt something inside her break completely, as though the last piece of her self-worth had finally been taken away. It was not just rejection, it was erasure. She walked out of that building with slow, heavy steps, her mind echoing with every insult, every betrayal, every moment that had led her to this point, and for the first time, she allowed herself to question everything she had ever believed in: faith, hope, kindness, integrity, wondering if they were nothing more than illusions designed to comfort people like her while the world continued to reward those who played by different rules. The contrast between her life and the world of the wealthy man she would one day meet felt impossible at this stage, because while others lived in comfort, surrounded by opportunity and respect, she was fighting just to be seen, just to be acknowledged as someone who mattered. The idea of a billionaire romance, a destiny helper, or kindness rewarded felt like a distant fantasy, something that belonged to stories, not to someone who had been broken so completely by reality. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into a blur of survival. As she drifted further away from the person she once was, her reflection in the mirror becoming a stranger she no longer wanted to face. Her eyes, once filled with hope, now carried only exhaustion, her posture weighed down by defeat, and her heart silenced by the fear of being hurt again. Everything she had believed in had failed her, and yet, somewhere deep within the ruins of her spirit, there remained a faint, almost invisible spark, a whisper of something that refused to die completely, although she could not name it, and she certainly did not trust it. Perhaps it was faith, perhaps it was the memory of who she used to be, or perhaps it was the quiet preparation for the emotional transformation that destiny had already set in motion. But at this moment, she did not see any of that. All she saw was darkness. The final rejection leaves her standing alone in a place where even hope refuses to follow, her heart empty, her spirit crushed. And as she looks ahead with nothing left to hold on to, she makes the most dangerous decision of her life, one that will lead her directly to the edge where destiny waits to intervene. With nowhere to go and no one to call her own, she enters a phase of silent suffering where survival itself becomes a painful daily battle. After the final rejection stripped her of the last fragments of dignity she had been desperately holding on to, she did not return home, because home had long stopped being a place of comfort and instead became just another reminder that she did not belong anywhere. The city, vast and indifferent, swallowed her existence without hesitation, and within days, she transitioned from being unseen to being completely erased, as though her presence had dissolved into the cold rhythm of a world that had no space for the broken. Her life entered a wilderness that was not defined by forests or deserts, but by empty streets, sleepless nights, and a silence so loud it echoed through her soul, forcing her to confront the painful truth that survival was no longer about living with purpose, but about enduring without meaning. She found temporary shelter in abandoned corners, under staircases, behind closed shops, and sometimes beneath the open sky, where the stars that once inspired her now looked distant and unreachable, as if even the universe had stepped back from her suffering. Hunger became her constant companion, a quiet but relentless reminder of how fragile her existence had become, and there were days when she went without food entirely, her body weakening while her spirit struggled to hold onto even the smallest thread of hope. Exhaustion wrapped itself around her like a heavy shadow, draining her energy, dulling her thoughts, and pushing her further into emotional numbness, where feeling nothing became easier than facing the weight of everything she had lost. People passed by her every day, well-dressed, purposeful, and untouched by the reality she was living, their eyes avoiding hers, their steps quickening as if acknowledging her existence would somehow disrupt their own carefully constructed lives. She was no longer seen as a person, but as a reflection of failure, a reminder of what happens when someone falls through the cracks of a society built on social status, wealth, and appearances. In a world where billionaire romance stories and life-changing love were celebrated, her reality stood in painful contrast, exposing the harsh truth that kindness and integrity alone were not always enough to survive. Yet even in this darkness, there were moments, small, almost invisible moments, that hinted at something deeper, something she could not fully understand, like when a stranger once left a piece of bread beside her without a word, or when an old woman offered her water with a gentle smile that carried more humanity than anything she had experienced in years. These moments, though rare, felt like whispers of divine favor, subtle reminders that perhaps kindness still existed somewhere, even if it had not yet found a permanent place in her life. But those fleeting gestures were not enough to heal the damage that had already been done, and as the days turned into an endless cycle of struggle, her internal conflict grew stronger, louder, and more unbearable. She began to question everything: her faith, her belief in hope, her trust in people, and even her own worth, wondering if her life had ever truly mattered or if she had simply been living an illusion built on false expectations. There were nights when she would sit alone, her back against a cold wall, her knees pulled close to her chest, and she would stare into the darkness, as if searching for answers that never came. Her thoughts became her greatest enemy, replaying every betrayal, every humiliation, every moment that led her to this point, until the pain became almost unbearable, pressing down on her with a force that made breathing feel like a struggle. In those moments, the idea of giving up began to feel less like a failure and more like a release, a way to escape a reality that had shown her nothing but cruelty and rejection. She fought against those thoughts at first, clinging to the remnants of her faith, reminding herself that somewhere, somehow, things could change, that perhaps a miracle was still possible, that maybe her story was not meant to end this way. But hope, when tested repeatedly, begins to weaken, and slowly, almost silently, she began to lose that battle. Her reflection in a broken mirror she once found on the street became a symbol of everything she had become: fragmented, distorted, and unrecognizable. And as she stared at herself, She no longer saw the girl who once believed in true love, honesty, and a future filled with possibility. Instead, she saw someone who had been completely broken by betrayal, someone who had given everything and received nothing in return, someone who no longer had the strength to keep fighting. It was in this wilderness of isolation and emotional destruction that her soul reached its lowest point, where even the idea of an emotional transformation felt impossible, and the concept of a happy ending seemed like a cruel joke. The world of wealthy men, parents' blessing, marriage proposal, and restoration belonged to a different reality, one she could not even imagine being part of anymore. And yet, deep within her, there was still a question she could not silence. What if? What if there was still something waiting for her beyond this pain? What if her story was not over? What if the kindness she had given so freely, the integrity she had held on it despite everything, the pure heart she had refused to corrupt, was not wasted after all? But those questions only made the silence louder, and the absence of answers pushed her closer to a decision she had been avoiding for far too long. On one particularly cold night, when the wind cut through her thin clothes and the emptiness inside her felt heavier than ever before, she stood up slowly, her movements deliberate, her expression calm in a way that was far more dangerous than despair, because this was not a moment of emotional breakdown, but a moment of quiet acceptance. She had reached the end. The empty streets stretched before her like a path leading nowhere, the darkness surrounding her like a final embrace. And as she began to walk, her steps steady and unwavering, she felt a strange sense of peace, as though she had finally made a decision that would free her from the endless cycle of suffering. The bridge was not far, the same bridge that separated two worlds, the same bridge where her story had begun to unravel. And now, it was where she intended to end it. On the night she decides to end everything, as she steps closer to the edge with a heart that has nothing left to lose, fate quietly begins to rearrange itself in ways she cannot see. And just as the darkness prepares to claim her, someone unexpected steps in her path, ready to change everything. When he offers help, she doesn't see kindness. She sees danger, because the world has taught her that every helping hand hides a hidden wound. The rain had not stopped, as if the sky itself refused to let the moment pass easily, and beneath that restless storm, she stood frozen between two worlds, the one she was ready to leave behind forever, and the one this stranger was silently inviting her to reconsider. His hand still held hers, steady and unwavering. Yet to her, that touch did not immediately feel like salvation. It felt like a test, a dangerous emotional risk wrapped in the illusion of kindness, because every time she had trusted someone before, she had paid the price with pieces of her soul. She pulled slightly, her fragile strength returning just enough to create distance. Her eyes filled not only with pain, but with suspicion, because a broken heart does not recognize love easily, and a wounded spirit does not accept help without questioning the cost behind it. In her world, nothing came without a hidden price, and every act of generosity carried the possibility of betrayal. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice trembling not from weakness alone, but from the weight of everything she had endured, her question carrying layers of fear, doubt, and disbelief, as though she was not just asking him, but challenging the very idea that someone could show kindness without expecting something in return. He did not answer immediately, and that silence, instead of creating tension, carried a calm presence that felt unfamiliar to her, as though he was not trying to convince her, not trying to impress her, but simply allowing her to exist in that moment without pressure. His patience was not forced, his composure not rehearsed, and his gaze remained steady, grounded in a quiet confidence that came from a place deeper than wealth or social status. "Because you need help," he finally said, his tone simple, almost disarmingly honest, yet carrying a depth that made her hesitate, because she had heard many words before, promises of love, declarations of care, but none had sounded like this, stripped of ego, free of manipulation, rooted in something that felt dangerously real. She shook her head slowly, stepping back again, her defenses rising instinctively as she tried to protect what little remained of her broken self. "People don't just help," she replied, her voice sharper now. laced with bitterness shaped by betrayal. There's always a reason, always something they want, and I don't have anything left to give. For a brief moment, something shifted in his expression. Not disappointment, not frustration, but a quiet understanding, as if he had expected her response, as if he knew that trust, once destroyed, does not return easily. He released her hand slowly, not as a sign of rejection, but as a gesture of respect, giving her the space she clearly needed, yet his presence did not retreat, and his eyes did not look away. "Then don't give anything," he said calmly, his words cutting through her defenses in a way she was not prepared for, because they carried no demand, no condition, no expectation, only a simple truth that challenged everything she believed about human nature. She stared at him, confused, unsettled, and strangely affected by his response, because it did not fit into the pattern she had learned to recognize. There was no manipulation in his tone, no hidden agenda in his posture, and no arrogance in his presence, despite the fact that he carried himself with a quiet authority that hinted at a life far removed from hers. This was her moral test. To accept his help meant risking everything again, risking her fragile sense of control, risking the possibility of being hurt once more, risking the chance that this unexpected meeting could become another painful chapter in her already shattered story. But to reject him meant returning to the darkness she had just tried to escape, continuing a life defined by isolation, suffering, and emotional emptiness. Her mind raced with conflicting thoughts, her heart caught in a battle between fear and a faint, unfamiliar pull towards something that felt almost like hope, although she did not trust that feeling enough to name it. She thought about her past, about the betrayal that had broken her, about the humiliation that had erased her dignity, about the countless times she had believed in people only to be abandoned when she needed them the most. And yet, standing in front of her was a man who did not fit that pattern. He did not push her, he did not pressure her, and he did not try to prove himself through grand gestures or empty promises. Instead, he stood there with a quiet strength, grounded in humility, honesty, and integrity, offering help without conditions, as if he truly believed that kindness, when given freely, had the power to create something meaningful. "Go home," she said finally, her voice softer now, but still guarded, her eyes avoiding his as she tried to regain control of the situation. "You don't belong here." A faint smile touched his lips, not out of amusement, but out of something deeper, something that suggested he understood more than she realized. "And where do you think you belong?" he asked gently, his question carrying a weight that made her chest tighten, because it forced her to confront a truth she had been avoiding. She had no answer. Silence stretched between them again, heavy yet strangely intimate, as the rain continued to fall, blurring the lines between the world she knew and the possibility of something new. For a moment, she considered walking away, turning her back on him, choosing the familiar pain of loneliness over the uncertain risk of trust. Her body shifted slightly, her feet preparing to move, her mind already convincing her that leaving was the safest choice, that accepting help would only lead to more suffering, that this moment was nothing more than a temporary illusion that would disappear as quickly as it had appeared. But something held her back. Not his hand this time, but his presence. There was a quiet certainty about him, something that did not demand belief but inspired it, something that did not promise miracles but felt like the beginning of one. She did not know who he was. She did not understand why he was there, and she certainly did not trust the idea that he could change anything about her life. Yet she could not ignore the feeling that this moment mattered, that this was not random, that this was not ordinary, that this was something deeper, something connected to a destiny she could not yet see. She turned slightly, her voice barely above a whisper, her resistance weakening just enough to reveal the vulnerability she had been trying so hard to hide. "What if I trust you, and you turn out to be like the rest?" she asked, her question carrying the weight of every betrayal she had ever experienced, her eyes searching his for any sign of deception, any indication that she was about to make another mistake. This time, he did not hesitate. He stepped closer, not invading her space, but closing the distance just enough for his presence to feel real, grounded, undeniable. "Then you walk away," he said, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. But not before you give yourself a chance to see what life could be if you stopped expecting it to hurt you. His words settled into her heart like something unfamiliar, something dangerous, something that threatened to break the walls she had built around herself. And for the first time, she felt the possibility of change. But just as she stood there, caught between fear and hope, between rejection and acceptance, between the past and an uncertain future, he revealed something that shifted everything. Just when she is about to walk away forever, he quietly says, "You think I don't understand pain, but everything you're running from is something I've already survived." And in that moment, her perception begins to crack, because this man is not just a stranger. He is someone whose truth could change everything she believes about life, love, and destiny. For the first time in a long time, someone sees her not as a burden, but as a person worth saving. The moment he spoke those words, something inside her shifted. Not completely, not enough to erase the scars of betrayal or the weight of her broken past, but just enough to interrupt the darkness that had consumed her for so long. It was not trust, not yet, but it was hesitation. And in a life where she had learned to expect pain, even hesitation felt like the beginning of something fragile and unfamiliar. She did not say yes immediately, because accepting help had never been simple for someone who had been hurt so deeply, yet she did not walk away either. And that silent pause became the first step in an emotional transformation she did not yet understand. The rain had softened into a quiet drizzle, as though the storm itself had begun to retreat, making space for something new, something gentler, something that felt almost like a second chance. "I don't need much," she finally said, her voice low, cautious, as if she was negotiating not just with him, but with her own fear. "Just something to eat, and I'll leave." He nodded without hesitation, not questioning her boundaries, not pushing for more than she was willing to give, and that simple act of respect carried more meaning than any grand gesture ever could. He led her away from the bridge, not toward luxury or overwhelming comfort, but toward something far more important, a place that felt safe. It was not a grand mansion, not yet, and certainly not what one would expect from a wealthy man, but it was warm, clean, and quiet, a small apartment tucked away from the noise of the world, where the chaos of her life seemed to pause at the door. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it, a shift in the air, a sense of calm that contrasted so sharply with the emptiness she had been living in that it almost felt unreal. This was her first encounter with a safe space. He did not overwhelm her with questions, did not demand explanations, and did not treat her like a project to be fixed. Instead, he moved with quiet intention, preparing food with a simplicity that reflected humility rather than wealth, as though he understood that what she needed most was not extravagance, but care. When he placed the plate in front of her, she hesitated for a brief moment, her instincts still guarding her, her mind reminding her that nothing in life came without a cost. Yet the warmth of the food, the sincerity in his actions, and the absence of pressure slowly broke down her resistance, and she took her first bite. It was not just food, it was dignity. And as she ate, slowly at first, then with the urgency of someone who had known hunger too closely, something inside her began to soften, not completely, but enough to allow a small spark of hope to flicker within the darkness. He watched quietly, not with pity, but with understanding, his presence steady, grounded in a kind of strength that did not need to be announced. This was not just a wealthy man offering temporary help. This was a destiny helper stepping into her life at the exact moment she needed it most, although she did not yet fully realize it. Over the next few days, their interaction remained simple, almost cautious, yet deeply meaningful in ways she could not explain. He offered her guidance, small suggestions on how to rebuild, not as commands, but as options, allowing her to make her own choices, restoring a sense of control she had long lost. He spoke to her with honesty, with integrity, never hiding behind his status, never using his wealth to create distance between them. And slowly, she began to see that not all power came with arrogance, and not all kindness came with conditions. There were moments when they sat in silence, not uncomfortable, but peaceful, where she would find herself watching him, trying to understand what made him different, what made him someone she could begin to trust. And although she did not have the answers, she could feel the difference. He was not trying to impress her. He was trying to help her find herself again. And that changed everything. Her healing did not happen suddenly, because emotional wounds do not disappear overnight, but began in small, almost invisible ways. In the way she started to sit up straighter, in the way her voice carried a little more strength, in the way her eyes slowly regained a hint of the light they once held. She began to speak more, sharing fragments of her past, her struggles, her pain, and each time she did, he listened, not interrupting, not judging, but simply being present. That presence became her first experience of true kindness in a long time. It was in these moments that she began to question everything she had believed about herself, about her worth, about her place in the world. Because if someone like him, a man who clearly existed in a different reality, a man whose life hinted at wealth, influence, and a level of social status she could not comprehend, could treat her with such respect, such sincerity, then perhaps she had been wrong about her own value. Perhaps she was not as invisible as she thought. Perhaps her story was not over. Perhaps this was the beginning of something greater, something that could lead to restoration, to gratitude, to a life she had once dreamed of but no longer believed in. There were moments, brief but powerful, where she allowed herself to imagine what life could be if this continued, if this connection deepened, if this unexpected meeting was not just temporary, but the start of something meaningful, something that could grow into life-changing love, into a bond built on trust, honesty, and shared understanding. But she was careful, because hope, while beautiful, was also dangerous, and she had learned that lesson too well. Yet even with her caution, she could not deny the change happening within her, the slow but undeniable shift from despair to possibility, from isolation to connection, from broken to healing. This was her first spark, not a miracle, not yet, but something just as powerful, the beginning of belief. And in that belief, something extraordinary was quietly taking shape, something that would one day evolve into a story of kindness rewarded, of a billionaire romance that defied expectations, of a journey from humble beginning to a life filled with respect, love, and meaning. But just as she began to feel safe, just as she started to trust the warmth of this new reality, just as the light began to replace the darkness, the past returned, not gently, not quietly, but like a shadow determined to destroy everything she had just begun to rebuild. Just as she begins to believe in hope again, a figure from her past appears without warning, carrying the weight of betrayal she thought she had escaped. And in that moment, she realizes that her greatest test is not behind her. It is standing right in front of her, ready to take everything away once again. From nothing, she begins to rebuild herself, and the same world that once ignored her starts noticing her silent rise. The shadow from her past did not destroy her this time, not completely, and although its sudden appearance shook her deeply, it also revealed something she had not yet realized, that she was no longer the same broken girl who once stood helpless against the weight of betrayal. Something within her had changed, quietly but powerfully, shaped by the kindness, patience, and unwavering presence of the man who had stepped into her life as a destiny helper when she had nothing left. She did not collapse. She did not run. Instead, she stood still, her heart racing, her emotions conflicted, yet her spirit holding on to something stronger than fear, a fragile but growing sense of self-worth that refused to disappear again. That was the beginning of her climb. It did not happen in dramatic leaps or sudden miracles, but in small, consistent steps that gradually rebuilt the foundation of her life. Under his guidance, she began learning new skills, not as a way to impress the world, but as a way to rediscover herself, to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped away from her piece by piece. He encouraged her to focus on what she could control, to invest in her growth, and to trust that even the smallest progress carried the power to create meaningful change. She started with simple tasks, assisting in small business activities connected to him, although she still did not fully understand the extent of his world. And in those early days, her confidence was fragile, easily shaken by doubt and the lingering echoes of her past. There were moments when she hesitated, moments when she questioned her abilities, moments when the fear of failure threatened to pull her back into the darkness she had just begun to escape. But each time she faltered, he was there, not to carry her, but to remind her of her strength. "You don't need to be perfect," he told her once, his voice steady, his words grounded in honesty and integrity. "You just need to keep going, even when it feels uncomfortable, because growth is never easy, but it is always worth it." Those words stayed with her, and slowly, she began to believe them. Her transformation was not just external. It was deeply emotional, rooted in a shift in how she saw herself, how she carried herself, and how she responded to the world around her. The same girl who once lowered her gaze now began to meet people with quiet confidence. The same voice that once trembled with uncertainty now carried a sense of purpose, and the same heart that once feared connection now started to open again, cautiously but sincerely. Opportunities began to appear, small at first, then gradually expanding, as though the universe itself was responding to her effort, her resilience, and the purity of her intentions. She secured a modest position that allowed her to contribute, to earn, to stand on her own again, and although it was not glamorous, it was meaningful because it represented something she had lost and finally regained: control over her life. For the first time in a long time, she felt useful, valued, seen. People began to notice her, not because she demanded attention, but because her presence carried a quiet strength that was impossible to ignore. Her humility, her kindness, and her unwavering honesty set her apart in a world often driven by superficial measures of success. And slowly, the same society that once dismissed her started to acknowledge her existence. This was not just success, it was restoration. And with each passing day, her gratitude grew, not only for the opportunities she was receiving, but for the man who had believed in her when she could not believe in herself. Their connection deepened naturally, not forced, not rushed, but built on mutual respect, shared understanding, and a bond that felt stronger than anything she had experienced before. He remained consistent, grounded in humility despite the subtle hints of a life far greater than what he revealed, and she found herself drawn to him, not because of what he had, but because of who he was, a man defined by integrity, kindness, and a quiet strength that made her feel safe in a way she had never known. There were moments when their conversations extended late into the night, where laughter replaced silence, where shared stories created connection, and where she began to feel something she had once lost completely: hope for love, not the kind built on illusion, but the kind rooted in truth, in patience, in genuine care. This was not just an emotional love story. This was the beginning of something deeper, something that felt like destiny. She did not name it yet, because she was still learning to trust, still healing from the scars of betrayal, still navigating the delicate balance between caution and possibility. But there were moments, brief, unspoken moments, where she wondered if this connection could become something more, something that could grow into life-changing love, into a bond strong enough to withstand the challenges of the world. And in those moments, she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time: happiness. Her life was changing, not overnight, but undeniably. From a broken past to a rebuilding present, from isolation to connection, from despair to hope, she was climbing, step by step, toward a future she had once believed was impossible. The idea of a miracle no longer felt distant. The concept of kindness rewarded no longer felt like a fantasy, and the possibility of a happy ending no longer felt out of reach. Yet, within this rising light, there remained something hidden, something unspoken, something that had not yet been revealed. Because the man who had helped her, the man who had become her mentor, her support, her unexpected source of strength, was not who she thought he was, not entirely. There were signs she had overlooked, details she had not questioned, moments that hinted at a truth far greater than what she understood, but she had been too focused on her own healing to notice them fully. Until now. Because just as her life began to stabilize, just as her confidence reached a level she had not known before, just as her heart started to open to the possibility of something real, the truth began to surface. Not slowly, not gently, but in a way that would change everything. Just when everything seems to be changing for the better, she discovers a truth that leaves her completely stunned. The man she trusted, the man who helped her rise, is not just a kind stranger, but a billionaire whose world is far beyond hers. and suddenly, she is forced to question whether their connection is real or just another illusion waiting to break her again. The one person she trusted more than anyone suddenly becomes the reason her world starts collapsing again. The truth did not arrive with warning or softness. It crashed into her reality with a force that shattered everything she had carefully rebuilt, leaving her standing once again at the edge of emotional destruction, questioning whether her life was cursed to repeat the same painful pattern of trust followed by betrayal. The man she had begun to rely on, the one she had slowly allowed into the fragile space of her healing heart, was no longer just a quiet helper with humility and kindness. He was a billionaire, a wealthy man whose life existed in a world defined by power, influence, and a social status so far removed from hers that it felt almost unreal. She did not hear it from him, and that was what hurt the most. The revelation came through others, through whispers, through the sudden shift in how people treated him when they thought she was not paying attention, and finally through a moment she could not ignore, when she saw him stepping out of a luxury car, surrounded by people who addressed him with a level of respect that did not belong to an ordinary man. The simplicity she had believed in, the humility she had trusted, now felt like a carefully constructed illusion, and her heart tightened with a painful realization. He had hidden the truth from her. And in her world, hidden truths always led to betrayal. Her mind began to race, pulling together every memory, every interaction, every moment that now seemed different under this new light, and the questions came quickly, relentlessly, tearing through the fragile peace she had built. Why would a billionaire choose to hide his identity? Why would a man with such power involve himself in her life? What did he truly want from her? The doubt was immediate. The pain followed. When she confronted him, her voice was not calm, not controlled, but filled with a mixture of hurt, anger, and fear, because this was not just about his wealth. It was about trust, about honesty, about the foundation of everything they had built together. "You lied to me," she said, her eyes searching his for answers, for explanations, for something that could make sense of the storm inside her. "You made me believe you were just like me." He did not deny it, and that silence only deepened the wound. "I didn't lie," he replied carefully, his tone steady but carrying a weight she could not yet understand. "I just didn't tell you everything." But to her, that was the same thing. Because in her experience, truth withheld was truth manipulated. Her heart, which had just begun to heal, felt like it was breaking all over again, the familiar ache of betrayal wrapping itself around her chest, tightening with every thought, every doubt, every fear that she had been naive enough to believe in something real again. "Do you know what it feels like?" she continued, her voice rising slightly, trembling under the pressure of her emotions. "To trust someone after everything you've been through, only to find out they were hiding something this big from you. Do you even understand what that does to a person like me?" He stepped closer, not aggressively, but with intention, his expression serious, his eyes filled with a sincerity she was too hurt to fully see. "I understand more than you think," he said quietly, "but I needed you to see me for who I am, not for what I have." But his words did not reach her. Not in that moment. Because pain has a way of distorting truth, and her past experiences had already taught her to expect the worst when something felt too good to be real. "You had everything," she said, her voice breaking now, the weight of her emotions finally spilling over. "You had power, money, a life I could never even imagine, and you still chose to hide behind a lie. Why? Was this some kind of moral test? Some experiment to see how a broken girl reacts to kindness?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and painful, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not frustration, but a quiet sadness, as though he realized that no matter what he said in this moment, it would not be enough to undo the damage. Before he could respond, another voice entered the moment. Sharp, calculated, destructive. "Well, isn't this interesting?" She turned, her heart sinking instantly as she recognized the face. A figure from her past, the same one who had played a role in her earlier betrayal, now standing there with a smile that carried nothing but malice. This was not coincidence. This was manipulation. "You really thought this was real?" the antagonist continued, stepping closer, their voice dripping with mockery. "A billionaire falling for someone like you? This isn't a touching story. This is reality, And in reality, people like him don't end up with people like you. The words hit exactly where they were meant to, deepening her insecurities, amplifying her doubts, and twisting her perception of everything she had experienced. This is what they do, the antagonist added, their tone lowering, more personal, more poisonous. They play with people like you, they act kind, they make you feel special, and then when they're done, they move on. You're just another chapter in his story, not the ending. She looked back at him, her eyes searching for denial, for anger, for anything that could contradict what she was hearing. But his silence, his inability to immediately shut down the accusations, only made everything worse. The damage was done. Her trust shattered. Her progress collapsed. The emotional transformation she had fought so hard to achieve now felt like a fragile illusion that had been ripped apart in a single moment, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and once again questioning her worth. Without another word, she stepped back, her decision forming not from clarity, but from pain, from fear, from the overwhelming belief that she had been deceived once again. "I can't do this," she said, her voice barely holding together, her heart already retreating into the safety of isolation. "I won't be fooled again." He reached out slightly, not to stop her, but to hold on to something that was slipping away too quickly. Yet this time, she did not hesitate. She pulled away, completely. And as she turned, walking away from the one person who had changed her life, the one person who had shown her kindness, hope, and the possibility of something real, she felt the weight of her decision settle heavily within her, even as she convinced herself it was the right one. Because sometimes, walking away feels safer than staying, even when it's a mistake. She walks away from him, believing she has been deceived, her heart closed once again to trust and love. But as she disappears into the distance, unaware of the truth she has left behind, the real danger begins to rise, silently, patiently, and far more destructive than anything she has faced before. This time, the pain is deeper because losing hope once hurts, but losing it twice destroys the soul completely. When she walked away from him, she believed she was protecting herself, convincing her shattered heart that distance was strength and isolation was safety. Yet what she did not realize was that this time, the fall would be far more devastating than before, because she was not just losing a person, she was losing the only light that had managed to reach her after years of darkness. The city felt colder than it had ever been, not because the weather had changed, but because something inside her had frozen completely. She returned to the same empty streets that once held her pain, but now they felt different, heavier, almost suffocating, because this time, she carried not just memories of betrayal, but the unbearable weight of regret. Every step she took echoed with questions she could not silence. Every quiet moment filled with the haunting possibility that she had made a mistake, that she had walked away from something real, something rare, something that might never come again. Her emotional collapse was not loud. It was silent, dangerously silent. She stopped trying to rebuild, stopped reaching for opportunities, stopped believing in the progress she had made, as though everything she had achieved was now meaningless, erased by a single truth she could not fully understand. The confidence she had started to develop faded quickly, replaced by doubt, confusion, and a deep, consuming exhaustion that drained her of the will to keep going. Isolation returned, stronger, more unforgiving. She pushed people away before they could get close, avoided places that reminded her of growth, and retreated into a version of herself that felt familiar, but painfully empty. The warmth she had experienced, the kindness she had received, the hope she had begun to trust, all of it now felt like a cruel illusion, a temporary escape that had only made her reality more unbearable when it disappeared. Her mind became her prison. She replayed every moment with him, every conversation, every gesture, every word, searching for signs she had missed, clues that could justify her decision. Yet the more she thought, the more confused she became, because nothing about him had felt fake, nothing about his kindness had felt forced, and nothing about their connection had felt like a lie. And that was what hurt the most. Because if it wasn't a lie, then why did it feel like betrayal? The questions turned into anger, the anger turned into frustration, and the frustration slowly dissolved into something far more dangerous: emptiness. She began to feel disconnected from everything, as though her emotions had shut down to protect her from further pain, leaving behind a hollow version of herself that simply existed without purpose. The nights became the hardest, dark, endless, filled with a silence so heavy it pressed against her chest, making it difficult to breathe, as though the world itself had paused, leaving her alone with her thoughts, her regrets, and the overwhelming feeling that she had lost something she could never replace. The storm returned, not outside this time, but within her. And just like before, she found herself drawn back to the same place where everything had begun. The bridge, standing tall and indifferent, separating two worlds, symbolizing a choice she had once made and was now being forced to face again. The wind was stronger that night, carrying a coldness that matched the emptiness inside her, and as she stepped closer to the edge, her movements slow, deliberate, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as though she had come full circle, as though her story had led her right back to the point where it could end. But this time, it felt different, not because the pain was less, but because it was deeper, more personal, more final. "I was wrong," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible against the wind, her eyes fixed on the darkness below. "Hope isn't for people like me." Tears fell silently, not with the intensity of desperation, but with the quiet acceptance of someone who had finally stopped fighting, someone who had given everything and received nothing but pain in return. The idea of a miracle, of divine favor, of kindness rewarded, of a life-changing love that could heal her completely, all of it now felt distant, unrealistic, almost foolish. Even the memory of him felt dangerous, because it reminded her of what she had lost, or perhaps what she had let go. Her heart tightened at that thought, a sharp, painful realization cutting through her numbness, forcing her to confront something she had been avoiding. What if he hadn't betrayed her? What if she had misunderstood everything? The possibility hit her like a sudden wave, shaking the fragile balance she had been holding on to, and for the first time since she walked away, doubt began to shift in a different direction, not toward him, but toward herself. Her breathing became uneven, her thoughts chaotic, her emotions clashing in a storm of confusion and regret as she struggled to make sense of everything that had happened. And then, she heard something. Not the wind, not the silence, but a voice. Familiar, urgent, calling her name. She froze, her body stiff, her heart racing, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing, because that voice did not belong to the past. It did not belong to the darkness. It belonged to something real, something she had left behind. Slowly, almost afraid to turn, she looked back, her eyes searching through the dim light, her breath caught between fear and hope. And in that moment, everything changed. At her lowest moment, standing on the edge between life and nothingness, she hears a truth that shatters everything she thought she knew, that the man she believed had deceived her was never her enemy, and the real betrayal was something far deeper, far more dangerous. And now, it is finally about to be revealed. The truth reveals that the person she blamed was actually protecting her all along. The voice that called her name did not belong to memory, illusion, or regret. It was real, urgent, and filled with a depth of emotion she had never heard before. And as she turned slowly, her heart caught between disbelief and fear, she saw him standing there, breathless, determined, and completely unshaken by the storm that had once again brought her to the edge. For a moment, neither of them spoke, because everything that needed to be said existed in the silence between them, heavy with pain, misunderstanding, and the fragile possibility of truth. The wind moved around them, the darkness stretching endlessly behind her, yet his presence stood firm, grounded, as though he had come not just to stop her, but to bring her back from a place she should have never returned to. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice weak, conflicted, still guarded despite the emotions rising within her, because seeing him again did not just bring relief. It brought confusion, anger, and the overwhelming weight of everything she thought she understood. "I was always going to be here," he replied, his voice steady but carrying a quiet intensity. "You just left before you could see why." Those words struck something deep within her, something she had tried to ignore, something that now demanded to be faced. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly, her eyes searching his with a desperation she could no longer hide. "Why didn't you tell me the truth? Why did you let me believe something that wasn't real?" He stepped closer, not rushing, not forcing the moment, but closing the distance enough for his presence to feel undeniable, real, and grounded in something stronger than the doubt she had been holding on to. "Because I needed you to be safe," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone, something heavy, something painful, that immediately shifted the air between them. She frowned slightly, confusion replacing anger for a brief moment, because that was not the answer she expected. "Safe from what?" she asked, her voice softer now, her defenses beginning to weaken under the weight of his sincerity. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the moment, sharp and filled with arrogance, echoing from behind them with a confidence that felt both familiar and dangerous. "You really think he was protecting you?" She turned instantly, her heart dropping as the truth began to unfold in a way she had not anticipated, because standing there was not just the antagonist from her past, but someone who carried a deeper connection to the man she had just walked away from, a connection that revealed everything she had misunderstood. "This whole thing was never about you," the antagonist continued, their voice cold, calculated. "It was about control, power, and keeping certain truths hidden until the right moment." Her confusion deepened, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the situation, her emotions shifting rapidly between fear, anger, and a growing realization that something far more complex had been happening behind the scenes. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice stronger now, driven by the need for answers she had been denied for too long. The man she had trusted stepped forward slightly, his expression no longer calm, but serious, focused, as though he had reached a point where the truth could no longer remain hidden. "They were watching you," he said, his words direct, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "From the moment you became involved in that situation before, from the moment you refused to compromise your integrity, you became a problem to people who don't tolerate honesty." Her breath caught, because suddenly, everything began to connect. The rejection, the sudden downfall, the manipulation, the betrayal that had felt too calculated to be accidental. "They used you," he continued, his voice steady but filled with a quiet anger. "And when you didn't break the way they expected, they tried to destroy you instead." She felt the ground beneath her shift, her entire perception of her past collapsing under the weight of this new truth, because what she had believed to be personal failure, what she had blamed on her own weakness, was something far more deliberate, far more cruel. "In you?" she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes locked onto him. "Where do you fit into all of this?" There was a pause, a heavy, significant pause. "I was trying to stop them," he said finally, his honesty cutting through the tension like a blade. "And when I found you, when I saw what they had done, I knew I couldn't just walk away." Her heart tightened, not with pain this time, but with realization. "That's why you didn't tell me," she whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. "You thought if I knew, it would make things worse." He nodded slightly, his gaze steady, his silence confirming everything she needed to understand. "I needed you to heal first," he said, his voice softer now. "I needed you to become strong enough to face the truth without it breaking you again." The weight of his words settled into her chest, heavy but grounding, because for the first time, she saw everything clearly, not through the lens of fear, not through the distortion of past trauma, but through truth. He had not deceived her. He had protected her. Every moment of kindness, every act of support, every step he had taken to help her rebuild was not part of a manipulation. It was a sacrifice, a deliberate choice to stand by her even when it complicated his own world, even when it placed him in direct conflict with forces far more powerful than she had ever imagined. And she had walked away. The realization hit her with full force, a wave of regret, gratitude, and overwhelming emotion crashing in her all at once, leaving her struggling to hold herself together as tears filled her eyes, not from pain, but from the weight of understanding. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice breaking under the intensity of her emotions. I thought you were like the rest." He shook his head gently, stepping closer, his presence steady, reassuring, unwavering. "I'm not here to be like the rest," he said, his voice firm yet filled with something deeper, something that felt like truth. "I'm here because you matter, whether you believe it or not." The words settled into her heart in a way nothing else had before, because they carried no expectation, no condition, no hidden agenda. Only honesty, only intention, only a connection that refused to break even after everything that had happened. This was her emotional realization, not just about him, but about herself, about her worth, about the strength she had built, about the possibility that her story was not defined by betrayal, but by resilience. And yet, even in this moment of clarity, the situation around them remained dangerous, unresolved, and far from over, because the forces that had once tried to destroy her were still present, still watching, still waiting for the opportunity to finish what they had started. The truth had been revealed, the villain exposed, the sacrifice understood, but now, a new decision stood before her, one that would define everything that came next. Now she must decide: run away again and protect herself from a world that nearly destroyed her, or stand beside the man who never gave up on her and fight for the life, the truth, and the destiny she almost lost forever. This time, she doesn't rise alone. She rises with purpose, strength, and a fire the world cannot extinguish. The moment she chose not to run, everything about her changed, not in a sudden dramatic transformation, but in a deep, unshakable shift that rooted itself within her soul. Because for the first time in her life, she was not standing alone against the world. She was standing beside someone who had already proven, through sacrifice, honesty, and unwavering integrity, that he would not let her fall again. The fear that once controlled her decisions began to lose its power, replaced by something far stronger: purpose, clarity, and a quiet but dangerous strength that had been forged through pain, betrayal, and survival. Their reunion was not filled with perfect words or unrealistic forgiveness, because the wounds were still fresh and the emotions still complex. Yet there was something more powerful than perfection holding them together, something built on truth, understanding, and the undeniable reality that their connection had survived a test strong enough to destroy something weaker. She looked at him differently now, not as a stranger, not as a wealthy man hidden behind humility, but as someone who had chosen her, protected her, and believed in her even when she could not believe in herself. "I won't run again," she said, her voice steady, carrying a strength that had not existed before. And those words were not just a promise to him, but a declaration to herself, a commitment to face whatever came next with courage instead of fear. He nodded, not with relief, but with respect, because he understood the weight of that decision. He understood that choosing to stand and fight after everything she had endured required more strength than most people could ever comprehend. And in that moment, their bond deepened into something unbreakable, not just emotional, but purposeful, aligned towards something greater than themselves. The battle they were stepping into was not private anymore. It was public, and the world that had once ignored her was about to witness her rise. The antagonist, who had operated in shadows, manipulating situations, controlling narratives, and using power to destroy those who stood in the way, was no longer hidden, because the truth had begun to surface, and with it came an opportunity, not just for justice, but for restoration. This was no longer just her personal struggle. It had become a public test, a moment where everything she had lost, everything she had rebuilt, and everything she had become would be challenged in front of the very society that once rejected her. She stepped into that world with hesitation at first, because the environment was unfamiliar, filled with people of influence, power, and social status far beyond anything she had experienced before. Yet this time, she did not shrink, she did not lower her gaze, and she did not allow the weight of comparison to break her spirit. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, grounded in the knowledge that her value was not defined by wealth, but by her journey, her resilience, and the integrity she had refused to compromise even in her darkest moments. Beside her stood the man who had changed everything, no longer hiding his identity, no longer holding back the truth, standing openly as a billionaire, a powerful figure whose influence extended far beyond what she had imagined. Yet despite his status, he remained the same man she had met on that bridge. Calm, grounded, driven by kindness, and guided by a moral compass that refused to bend under pressure. Together, they faced the challenge. It came in the form of exposure, confrontation, and a public platform where the truth would be tested against deception, where honesty would stand against manipulation, and where she would have to find the strength to speak, not just for herself, but for everything she represented. The moment demanded courage, not just emotional, but visible, undeniable courage that could not hide behind silence anymore. As she stood before an audience that once would have dismissed her without a second thought, she felt the weight of her past rise within her, the memories of rejection, humiliation, and betrayal threatening to pull her back into the shadows. Yet this time, something was different. She did not break. She spoke. Her voice, though slightly trembling at first, carried a truth that could not be ignored as she shared her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor, exposing the injustice she had faced, revealing the manipulation that had nearly destroyed her, and standing firmly in the reality of who she had become, a woman shaped by pain, but defined by strength. The room changed. The atmosphere shifted. Because truth, when spoken with conviction, has the power to disrupt even the most controlled narratives. The antagonist, once confident and untouchable, now stood exposed, their influence weakening under the weight of evidence, their control slipping as the truth dismantled the illusion they had carefully constructed. For the first time, they were not in control of the story, and that loss of power revealed a desperation that made them even more dangerous. This was the test, not just of truth, but of endurance. Because even as the truth surfaced, even as justice seemed within reach, the final outcome was not yet decided, and the tension in the air carried a warning that this was far from over. Through it all, she remained standing, her presence no longer invisible, her voice no longer silenced, and her identity no longer defined by the opinions of others. She had crossed a line that could not be undone, stepping fully into the person she was meant to become, a transformation so powerful that it demanded recognition, respect, and acknowledgement. And beside her, he stood unwavering, not as her savior, but as her partner, someone who had walked beside her through every stage of her journey, from brokenness to strength, from isolation to connection, from despair to purpose. This was no longer just a story of survival. It was a story of power, of restoration, of destiny unfolding exactly as it was meant to. Yet even in this moment of rising strength, there remained one final obstacle, one last decision, one defining moment that would determine everything that followed, because the truth alone was not enough. The outcome depended on what happened next. The world was watching. The stakes were higher than ever, and the final moment was approaching. Everything comes down to one final moment, where truth will either prevail or be buried forever, where love will either stand strong or be torn apart, and where their destiny, built from pain, tested by betrayal, and strengthened by resilience, will finally be decided once and for all. The same world that once rejected her now stands silent as she reclaims her dignity, power, and identity. The moment of decision did not arrive with noise or chaos, but with a heavy, almost suffocating silence that filled the room as every eye remained fixed on her, waiting, watching, anticipating whether she would rise or collapse under the pressure of a world that had once dismissed her without hesitation. The truth had been spoken, the lies had been exposed, and the fragile balance between justice and deception stood on the edge of collapse. Yet what would happen next depended not on power, not on influence, but on courage, the kind of courage that is born not from comfort, but from surviving everything meant to destroy you. She stood there, no longer the broken girl who had once been pushed into silence, but a woman transformed by pain, strengthened by resilience, and guided by a clarity that could not be shaken, because she now understood something she had never fully grasped before, that her worth was never defined by rejection, her identity was never determined by betrayal, and her future was never meant to be controlled by those who thrived on manipulation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet authority that commanded attention, not because it was loud, but because it was real, grounded in truth, shaped by experience, and impossible to ignore. She did not speak to seek validation. She did not speak to prove herself to anyone. She spoke because the truth demanded to be heard. And in that moment, her words became more than just a response. They became a declaration of who she had become. The evidence presented, the testimonies revealed, and the undeniable exposure of the antagonist's actions dismantled the illusion they had built so carefully, stripping away their power piece by piece until all that remained was the reality they had tried to hide. Their confidence faded, replaced by desperation, their control slipping as the weight of truth pressed down on them. And for the first time, they were forced to face the consequences of their actions in a space where manipulation no longer held power. The victory was not sudden, and it was not easy, but it was undeniable. Justice did not come as revenge, but as restoration. The same society that had once turned its back on her now watched in silence, their perception shifting as they witnessed not just the exposure of wrongdoing, but the rise of someone they had underestimated, someone they had ignored, someone they had failed to see when she needed it the most. Recognition followed, not as sympathy, but as respect, because her journey had proven something that could not be dismissed. Strength built through suffering carries a power that no privilege can replicate. Her name, once forgotten, now carried weight. Her presence, once invisible, now demanded acknowledgement. Her story, once dismissed, now inspired. And in the midst of it all, she stood grounded, not consumed by the attention, not overwhelmed by the sudden shift in how the world saw her, but anchored in the truth of who she was, a woman who had survived, who had endured, and who had risen not because life was kind to her, but because she refused to let it break her completely. Beside her stood the man who had walked this journey with her, no longer hidden behind simplicity, no longer misunderstood, but fully seen for who he truly was, a wealthy man, a billionaire whose power extended far beyond wealth, defined not by status, but by his unwavering commitment to kindness, honesty, and integrity. His role in her story was no longer questioned, no longer doubted, but recognized as something rare, something genuine, something that had changed not only her life, but his as well. Their connection, tested through misunderstanding, broken trust, and painful separation, had emerged stronger, deeper, and more real than anything either of them had experienced before, because it was not built on illusion, but on truth, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand beside each other even when everything fell apart. When their eyes met in that moment, no words were needed, because everything they had been through, everything they had lost, and everything they had rebuilt existed within that silent exchange, carrying a depth of emotion that could not be expressed through language alone. Love had not only survived, it had evolved. Respect had not only been restored, it had been earned. And for the first time, she allowed herself to fully accept it, not with fear, not with hesitation, but with a quiet confidence that came from knowing she was no longer the person she used to be. She no longer questioned whether she deserved happiness, whether she was worthy of love, or whether her story could have a meaningful ending, because she had lived through the worst and still found her way forward. This was her triumph, not just over the antagonist, not just over the world, but over the version of herself that once believed she was not enough. The journey from a humble beginning to a life filled with recognition, respect, and purpose had not been easy, and it had not followed the path she once imagined. Yet it had led her exactly where she needed to be, a place where she could stand fully in her truth, unapologetically powerful, and undeniably transformed. And yet, even in this victory, even as the world acknowledged her rise, even as love and respect surrounded her, there remained something unspoken, something lingering beneath the surface, something that neither of them could ignore completely. Because every triumph comes with a cost. Every victory carries a weight. Every transformation demands a sacrifice. And as the moment settled, as the noise faded into quiet recognition, as the reality of what they had achieved began to take shape, a question remained, one that could not be avoided, one that would follow them beyond this moment, into whatever came next. But even in victory, as she stands in the light she once believed she would never reach, one final truth lingers quietly beneath the surface. What did it truly cost them, emotionally, personally, and irreversibly, to become the people they are now. And is there a price still left to pay? Some stories are not about being saved. They are about discovering that even in your darkest moment, one hand can rewrite your destiny. Long after the noise of victory had settled and the world had moved on to its next story, she found herself standing in a quiet place, not surrounded by cameras, not defined by recognition, but grounded in a deep reflection of everything she had lived through, because the journey from brokenness to restoration does not end with triumph. It transforms into understanding, into wisdom, into a truth that can only be seen clearly when the storm has passed. She often thought about that night on the bridge, the moment where everything could have ended before it ever truly began, and how a single decision, a single hesitation, a single unexpected meeting had altered the entire direction of her life. It was never just about being saved, never just about someone stepping in at the right time, but about what she chose to do after that moment, about the strength she found within herself to stand again, to trust again, to believe again, even when every part of her past told her not to. Her journey was not a simple emotional love story, and it was not a fairy tale shaped by perfection, because it carried pain, betrayal, rejection, and loss at every stage. Yet within that pain existed something far more powerful: growth, resilience, and an emotional transformation that redefined her completely. She had learned that hope is not something you wait for. It is something you fight for, something you protect, even when it feels fragile, because without it, the darkness becomes permanent. There were moments when she questioned everything, moments when she believed that kindness was weakness, that honesty was a burden, and that integrity had no place in a world driven by power and social status. Yet her life became proof that these very qualities, when held onto with courage, carry a strength that cannot be destroyed. Kindness, when given without expectation, does not make you vulnerable. It makes you human, and humanity, even in its quietest form, has the power to change destinies. She understood now that trust is not about avoiding pain, but about choosing to believe despite the risk, because without trust, connection cannot exist, and without connection, life loses its meaning. The fear of betrayal will always remain. The possibility of heartbreak will never disappear. Yet the willingness to open your heart again, to take that risk, is what allows life-changing love to enter. The kind of love that is not based on illusion, but on truth, respect, and shared growth. Her story also revealed something deeper about resilience, something that cannot be taught, but must be lived, because resilience is not about never falling. It is about refusing to stay down when everything around you is pushing you to give up. She had fallen more than once. She had been broken in ways she never thought she could recover from. Yet each time, something within her refused to disappear completely, something that kept her moving, even when she could not see the path ahead. And perhaps that is where divine favor truly exists. Not in the absence of struggle, but in the presence of strength when you need it the most, in the unexpected moments that shift everything, in the people who enter your life at the exact time you are about to lose everything. The man who had once been a stranger became more than just a destiny helper. He became a reflection of what true love, humility, and integrity look like when they are lived, not spoken. Their relationship was not defined by wealth, not by the idea of a billionaire romance, not by the difference in social status, but by the choices they made for each other, the sacrifices they were willing to endure, and the truth they refused to compromise. It became a reminder that love, when real, does not seek to control, does not seek to dominate, but seeks to uplift, to protect, and to grow alongside the person it chooses. As she looked back, she no longer saw herself as the girl who had been abandoned, rejected, and broken, but as someone who had walked through fire and emerged stronger, wiser, and more grounded in who she truly was. Her gratitude was not just for the outcome, not just for the success or the recognition, but for the journey itself, because without the struggle, she would have never discovered her strength. Without the pain, she would have never understood her worth. And without the darkness, she would have never recognized the light when it finally appeared. And now, standing in a life she once believed was impossible, she carried a message that extended far beyond her own story, something meant for anyone who has ever felt invisible, anyone who has ever been pushed to the edge, anyone who has ever believed that their life had no value. She would ask quietly, yet powerfully, how many times have you allowed your past to define your future? How many times have you walked away from something real because fear convinced you it was not meant for you? How many times have you stood at your own edge, believing that there was no reason left to keep going? And more importantly, what if you were wrong? What if your story is not over? What if the very moment you are ready to give up is the moment everything is about to change? What if the pain you carry is not the end, but the beginning of something greater? Because her story, as extraordinary as it may seem, is not unique in its possibility. It is only unique in its unfolding. And somewhere in another place at another time, someone else is standing where she once stood, feeling the same emptiness, the same silence, the same overwhelming belief that nothing will ever get better. And that is where the truth of her journey becomes more than just a story. It becomes a message, a reminder, a possibility that no matter how broken you feel, no matter how many times you've been betrayed, no matter how invisible the world has made you, there is always a chance, always a moment, always a possibility that something or someone can enter your life and change everything. Not by saving you, but by reminding you that you're worth saving. And sometimes that is all it takes. Because somewhere out there, someone is still standing at the edge, lost in silence, ready to disappear. And maybe, just maybe, all they need is one hand, one moment, one act of kindness that refuses to let go. And in that single moment, their entire destiny could begin again. If this story made your heart heavy, if it reminded you of a moment when you almost gave up but somehow survived, then don't ignore that feeling, because that pain connects you to this story in a real way. Tell me honestly in the comments, have you ever stood at your own breaking point, where everything felt finished, and what stopped you from letting go? Like this video and subscribe, because the next story might not just entertain you, it might be the one that speaks directly to your soul when you need it the most. And if you know someone who is silently fighting their own battle right now, don't wait, share this story with them, because sometimes one message, one story, one moment can pull someone back from the edge.